Most people, when they think about Dead by Daylight, they think about looping and hooking and flashlights and all that kind of stuff, and that's part of Dead by Daylight. But every single character in that game has a story. The killers, the survivors, every one of them had a life before the fog took them. Some of these stories are tragic, some are disturbing, and a few of them are downright terrifying. Because the entity just didn't collect monsters, it also collected people. So every now and then on this channel, we're going to slow things down and talk about those stories. The lives these characters lived, the moments that changed them, and the strange path that led them straight into the entity's trials. Some of these stories belong to survivors, others to the killers, but every one of them begins the same way, when someone stepped into the fog and never came back. Alright, pull up a chair for a minute. Let's talk about the tragic story of Dwight Fairfield. Now, if you played Dead by Daylight for any amount of time, you've probably seen a Dwight. Glasses, button-up shirt, nervous expression, usually looking like he's about 5 seconds away from panicking. Let's be honest here. A lot of folks like to joke about Dwight. He's the guy hiding in the locker, the one crouching behind a rock while the killer walks past, the one who accidentally drops a pallet a little too early. But here's the thing about Dwight Fairfield. People think he's weak. People think he's scared. But the truth is, Dwight survived something long before he ever stepped into the fog. And once you hear his story, the way he behaves in the trial starts to make a whole lot more sense. Because Dwight Fairfield didn't become a survivor overnight. No sir. Dwight Fairfield spent most of his life learning how to survive without anyone noticing he was there at all. Dwight wasn't what you'd call a remarkable kid growing up. He wasn't the fastest, he wasn't the strongest, and he definitely wasn't the most popular. In fact, if you ask most people from Dwight's high school if they remember him, they'd probably squint for a second trying to picture the name. That's just the kind of life Dwight lived. He was a scrawny kid with oversized glasses. The one who always seemed a little nervous, like he was expecting trouble even when nothing bad was happening. Dwight, well, he wanted to fit in. He wanted that real bad, just like most teenagers do. He watched the popular kids laugh and carry on in the hallways, watched them walk into class with confidence, watched them sit together at lunch like they belonged there. Dwight wanted that feeling, so every now and then he tried to reach for it. One year he decided he was going to try out for the football team. Now if you've ever been around high school football, you know that that's not exactly the easiest place for a skinny, nervous kid to make his mark. But Dwight showed up anyway. Helmet a little too big, pads hanging off his shoulders, trying to stand tall even though he probably felt about 2 inches tall inside. The coaches watched him run a few drills, watched him try to keep up with the rest of the players, and before long, they cut him loose. Just like that, no ceremony, no encouragement, just a quiet, "Thanks for coming out, kid." That was the end of Dwight's football career. And, well, basketball, it didn't go any better. Truth be told, they didn't even really give him a chance there. Some kids have that natural athletic confidence. Dwight, well, he didn't. He didn't have any confidence. And when you combine that with being shy, awkward, and a little unsure of yourself, well, people tend to overlook you. Dwight's grades weren't anything exactly shining either. He wasn't failing, he just wasn't impressing anyone. He was, well, average. Which might not sound too bad, but when you're already invisible socially, being average everywhere else just makes you fade into the background even more. So, Dwight developed a skill, not on purpose, but out of necessity. He learned how to disappear. Now, I don't mean literally vanish like a magician, I just mean he could blend into the background so well people barely noticed he was even there. For Dwight, invisibility became survival. After high school, Dwight's life didn't suddenly turn around. There was no big transformation where he became confident and successful. He didn't start a flashy career, he didn't reinvent himself. Instead, Dwight found himself working a pretty ordinary office job, kind of place with a gray cubicle, humming fluorescent lights, and a coffee machine that always made coffee that tasted just a little burnt. You've probably seen places like that. Everyone shows up, does their work, leaves at the end of the day, and most of the time, no one really stands out. Dwight fit into that environment perfectly, not because he loved it, but because it didn't require him to be anything special. He could just exist quietly. Now, every once in a while, companies like to organize what they call team building exercises. Now, that sounds real nice on paper, but most folks know what that usually means. Awkward activities. Forced bonding. People pretending they're enjoying themselves more than they really are. Dwight's boss decided the office could use a little bit of that, so one weekend he organized a company retreat out in the woods. A chance for everyone to get out of the office, breathe some fresh air, strengthen the team, at least that's what he told everyone. So Dwight packed up and went along with the rest of his coworkers. Not because he was excited about it, but because Dwight had always been the type to follow along with whatever was expected of him. They drove out to a stretch of woods far away from the city. Tall trees, quiet air, the kind of place where the sounds of civilization fade away real quick. As evening rolled in, they built a campfire. People sat around, laughing, telling stories, trying to enjoy themselves. And that's when Dwight's boss pulled out something very special. A jar of moonshine. Now, this wasn't the store-bought liquor. This was homemade stuff. A family recipe. The kind that'll sneak up on you if you're not careful. The jar started making its way around the group. People took swigs, laughed, coughed a little. Dwight eventually took his turn. He lifted the jar, took a sip, and that's the last clear thing he remembered from that night. When Dwight woke up the next morning, the world was quiet. Too quiet. His head was pounding, the kind of pounding you get when last night's drink come back to remind you they were stronger than you thought. He pushed himself up slowly, blinking in the morning light, and right away something felt wrong. The campfire had gone cold. The campsite was empty. No coworkers, no boss, no cars, nothing. Just Dwight Fairfield sitting alone in the middle of the woods. Now maybe they forgot him. Maybe they thought he left early. Or maybe they didn't even notice he was gone. And if you lived Dwight's life up to that point, you'd probably assume the same thing Dwight did. That nobody bothered to check. Because Dwight Fairfield had spent his life being overlooked. So he stood up, brushed the dirt off his clothes, and started walking. At first, the woods seemed normal enough. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, the usual sounds you'd expect from a quiet forest. Dwight figured if he just kept moving long enough, he'd eventually find a road, maybe a trail, maybe even a ranger station? Something that could point him back to civilization. But the deeper he walked, the stranger things began to feel. The air grew heavier, the woods felt thicker, and then a fog started rolling in. Now, fog in the woods isn't exactly unusual, but this fog, well, it was different. It didn't drift, it didn't lift, it just settled, thick and silent. The kind of fog that swallows all sound. The kind that makes every shadow feel a little deeper than it should be. Dwight kept walking. What else could he do? But before long, he could barely see the few steps in front of him. The trees faded into shapes, the forest disappeared behind him, and somewhere inside that endless fog, Dwight Fairfield vanished. From that day forward, nobody ever heard from Dwight again. No missing person report led to answers. No search parties ever found a trace. As far as the world was concerned, Dwight Fairfield had simply disappeared in the woods. But we know what really happened, because beyond that fog, something was waiting. Something ancient, something hungry, something known as the Entity. And then, Dwight stepped into that fog. He stepped into a nightmare that never ends. But here's the part that makes Dwight different from the rest of the survivors. Most people would fall apart in that place. Imagine it. Killers stalking you through the darkness, hooks hanging from poles, an endless cycle of terror. But Dwight had already spent his entire life preparing for something like that, without even realizing it. Because all those years learning how to stay out of trouble, all those years slipping through hallways unnoticed, all those years blending into the background, they taught Dwight a skill that most people never learn, how to survive by being unseen. And in the trials of Dead by Daylight, that skill can mean the difference between life and death. Dwight isn't the strongest survivor. He's certainly not the bravest, but he understands something very important. Sometimes survival isn't about fighting. Sometimes survival is about knowing when to hide, when to move quietly, when to guide others without drawing attention. That's why Dwight often becomes leader of survivor teams, which is kind of funny when you think about it. The kid who spent his entire life being ignored, now suddenly people rely on. They follow his directions, they trust his instincts, because Dwight knows how to stay alive. And maybe, just maybe, all those years of being invisible weren't a weakness after all. Maybe they were training for a nightmare waiting for somewhere for him in the fog. And now, every time Dwight runs into a trial, every time he slips past a killer unnoticed, every time he helps another survivor escape, he proves something, that even the quietest person in the room can become the one who survives. And that is the story of Dwight Fairfield, the survivor that no one ever noticed until the fog swallowed him whole. There are other survivors, other stories, the killers, but those are a story for another night in the fog.
I feel nauseous, believe me. Never had a lot of shit come easy. Had to work hard, struggle just to be me. Had to rise up just so they could see me.